Welcome to IB Unplugged, a Cognity podcast for IBDP educators that tackles your submitted questions and challenges by connecting you with experts and peers who share their ideas and stories from real classrooms. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of IB Unplugged, where I'm joining John in St. Gilgen. And we are recording this the day after an IB day in Vienna, where we got to have a live episode with Dženana. And we talk about this Hidden Curriculum 2.0. And we loved the conversation so much that we said we need to do this for everybody. And so we got to do it twice. And this has been such a great episode. It's something that originally when we reached out to Dženana, we were thinking we were going to talk about English with her because she's an English teacher. She's an examiner. We were going to talk about that. And then we started learning about her PhD work and we were like, oh, that's a lot more fun.
Yeah.
And so we pivoted. We started talking about these ideas of the national identity and how there's a tension between that and international mindedness in international schools. And we were able to create this episode around these topics. So these are all things we're going to dive into. And yeah, I'm really excited about this one.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Dženana is a brilliant individual who, she's an English teacher, a TOK teacher at Vienna International School. And you're going to see elements of that kind of pull through. I mean, anybody who has this sort of international mindedness approach in your classes, you're going to notice things that are kind of common to TOK and what we can do. And at the same time, what I'm really excited about for this is kind of diving into that tension that exists when you have an international school that's filled up with people who have different national identities or maybe don't have a national identity, and kind of this understanding of like, where do I belong here? And how can we as educators in these schools help to facilitate that belonging? So this episode, I think is going to have a whole lot of exciting things for us that we can really learn a lot from and start questioning our own practice and say, how can we make this a truly international community that doesn't just ignore national identities, but recognizes them, in many cases can celebrate them and help people understand their own identity in this space. So really exciting episode. We're super glad you're here and we really hope you enjoy this show. Hi, Dženana. Welcome to IB Unplugged. We're so glad that you're here.
Hi.
Yeah, we are excited because obviously we did a live show. We were able to do a live show at an ACES conference in Vienna. But unfortunately, some of the tech didn't work out too well for us. So we're really, really thankful that you're taking some time here to come back and visit these things that we spoke about there in the live show. So really, really appreciate your time and visiting with us again.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. So we're going to get into this idea of the hidden curriculum, international identities, national identities, how this all, like this tension that exists in international schools. And with this kind of comes this idea of where people are from and their home and their background. And so just to kind of warm up and help our listeners get to know you a little bit, I wonder if you could tell us what's home to you?
It's always an interesting question. I think for me, definitely home is a place where I have very fond memories. So it was, for example, Bosnia before the war, so childhood memories, but also a country that welcomed me with open arms and embraced me and gave me so many opportunities, which is the United States. So I associate home with a place of belonging or a place that allows me to thrive, and a place of memories. I feel have such a great role when identifying or looking at what we really perceive as home.
Beautiful. In your research, you talk about the national being the ugly duckling, especially when we're compared to globalization and this international school context. Could you lean into that and explain what you mean by that?
Sure. As I began working on my PhD work and I was reading more about the national and having this experience in international schools, I never really touched upon, the national and the international. And I was reading work by a scholar, Daniel Troller, and he was talking about how after Cold War, you had so much researchers in education focused so much on the international or on the globalization, especially, that global became this dazzling white swan, and any research on the national became the ugly duckling. And I thought it was such an interesting way to look at it, which I was never exposed to.
Nice. Well, I think, we've gotten to know you a little bit here, and we want to dive straight into understanding this, because I think when we get into this idea of the hidden curriculum, there are plenty of educators out there who maybe don't exactly know what we're talking about. And I know that we've kind of coined this as hidden curriculum 2.0. So maybe give us kind of a basis here. What are we talking about when we say hidden curriculum? And I guess what's the difference between 1.0 and 2.0?
Sure. So I'll start with the hidden curriculum itself. So the term was coined by Philip Jackson in this book he wrote about life in classrooms. It was 1968 when the book was published, and it was his observation of primary school classrooms in the United States. Now, this was a long time ago, right? But the book is still such a classic because he talks about how through the nexus of crowds, praise, and power, students, you can decode the hidden curriculum. So, for example, through the crowds, through interactions with each other, students learn much about what is allowed and what is not allowed to do. Whether it's like raising your hand to go to the bathroom, you can say you're teaching you respect, but you also might be teaching obedience. They learn how to be patient when they line up for the lunch and to grab their the lunch in the cafeteria. They learn to be patient. Sometimes they're not called upon when they raise their hands. That's another way you teach them, patience. But they also learn how to evaluate each other because they see how teachers evaluate them. Another aspect, so that was the praise and crowds, and then there's the aspect of power. They learn that the teacher is the authority figure. And they learn that obviously through interactions with the teacher, but also the sense of obedience and so on. So basically the concept, I think it nails down to, which is still so relevant and so important today. It doesn't matter if you're in international schools or not. Because when he did this research, it wasn't in international schools. It was in public schools in the US, in primary schools. And what are students asked to be rather than do in your school? And I think that is something that we can still focus on. Like, what are we actually teaching students to be, but through the means of the hidden curriculum, not the taught necessarily. And I thought it was so valuable, but I realized that the research so far lacked the focus on what are we asking students to be in context of national identities, or what are we, what kind of national identities are extrapolated as a result of the hidden curriculum. People have done studies on the socioeconomics aspects of it, and much of other things, but they have not done work on the national and the extrapolation of the national through the hidden curriculum. Mm-hmm. And I really wanted to touch upon that. So what I combined it with is Michael Billig's work called Banal Nationalism, where he says that national is always flagged, directly or indirectly. It doesn't have to be through flags and symbols, and it can be very much through the way we talk about the nation, by being linguistically microscopic, and really looking at how nations are perhaps discursively constructed, but also there's an everyday, he says that there are routines and things we do every day that flag the nation. And I wanted to combine these two theories together, and with the help of my supervisor, we came up with, or he labeled it, and we worked together on the Hidden Curriculum 2.0. Mm. Mm.
So it's okay, like I think I get it then. So teachers have a specific curriculum that obviously we're teaching to, maybe that's more subject specific, but the hidden curriculum is like the values, the sort of cultural, behavioral expectations that are implicitly, or more, I guess, implied in terms of what people need to be doing to be accepted in this culture, and that culture being defined by the school itself. Is that right?
That's absolutely correct. So that's exactly what it is. And the challenge with this is that everything is hidden and banal. And how do you decode something that is almost invisible? Mm-hmm. So unless you strap a camera on yourself, it's not ideal. But that's why it was really helpful for me when I went into 3 different international schools to do this research, was to not just observe, but also elicit interviews from students and staff. So some of the questions I had in my mind were, or in the background were, whose cultural thesis is at the forefront. How are nations flagged indirectly? So that was kind of the essence of the research.
Yeah. When you were going into these IB classrooms, I'm sure some of it you had a preconceived idea of what you were expecting to find. What kind of messages did you uncover or recognize that were surprising to you and not what you expected?
Yeah, that's another really great question. I think for me, working in international schools, I expected every child to be like, I'm a third culture kid. I am the notion of national and going to these schools because they were ideologically peace-driven schools and demographically diverse, and I was really worried about, because the national, we don't really emphasize much. We want to say, we are global citizens. So when I did observe these classrooms, it was interesting when students. There was one lesson, for example, where students talked about languages and language prestige. And you will hear French students, for example, say, well, I speak, the most proper French because my country's bigger and we know our French. And compared to other countries where French is a home language. So it was really interesting. Or you'll have even Italian students say, well, my part of Italy speaks the best Italian. So it really mattered to them, and I didn't see that coming, because language is one of the markers of national identity, if you will. And another part was when they did discuss some of these global conflicts and so on, there was this kind of avoidance. The moment it got a little bit, perhaps, I don't want to say heated, but a little bit, heated or opposing views were throwing at each other, there was a bit of an avoidance of articulating this or exploring this further. So those are two things that really came up.
It's fun, as you're saying that, I'm kind of chuckling to myself because I'm an American at an international school with a bunch of British teachers as well. And often, I would say at least once a week, we have conversations over the dinner table or over the lunch table of like whose English is right.
Oh, yeah.
you know, who kind of speaks the easiest and how, do students understand it better and that sort of thing. So it's funny because I guess it doesn't just exist with students. I think that pulls up to teachers as well.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And that question also came up. And this is also the beauty of the International Baccalaureate, because they can have this forum to discuss all these global issues. So it was interesting because when that came up, many kids were very much united on the fact that it's Queen's English that's the proper English.
Yeah. I remember there was a story of, we had a student here who their English teacher was from Australia, and he had like a big issue with it. He's like, no, you can't teach me English. I have to go with somebody from, Britain to teach me English. Yeah.
And that was interesting because they were responding this, but the teacher was from United States. So it was like, oh, what are these kids saying? And I was, but this is what they think and this is how they perceive it.
Yeah, I want to come back to this thing you mentioned from, I think you said it was Jackson's work, and the idea of like crowds, praise, and power, and how these can kind of help us recognize banal nationalism. You mentioned that nationalism is kind of a hard thing to pull out. There are certain indicators of it. What do you mean when you say things like crowds, praise, and power help us to understand that better? Can you unpack that for me, please?
Mm-hmm. So, through crowds, they get to learn about each other's, in this case, culture. So what languages are, prioritized, what religious celebrations are prioritized, because those are also some components of the national historically. So whose memories are validated. So, for example, when I interviewed some of the kids, they said, when it comes to religious holidays, they said, I learned a lot about Diwali. I learned a lot about Ramadan because I interacted with a friend. And my friend actually exposed me to the idea that when we do celebrate these holidays, their holidays, so Ramadan, Diwali, and so on, are just one slide during our advisory meeting, and I wouldn't have noticed the exposure or the mass exposure of one holiday versus another had had it not been for this student who is my friend from another culture and who has actually mentioned this exposure to me or lack of exposure to me, so or representation. So I think that is something that like the crowds component, right? When it comes to the praise and power, I think they do notice how certain things are framed in the classroom, and this is where discourse and language plays a role, and how certain memories are validated. So I think and as I mentioned this during our conference, I think it was Viet Thanh Nguyen who said, battles are first fought on the field, or wars are first fought on the field and then in memories. Mm-hmm. So for students who have different perceptions about certain events, right, or they've been historically or from their parents taught that this is how certain global conflicts occurred or certain, events occurred historically, it is interesting how the teacher brings it in and how the teacher frames it, because then they can recognize which memories are validated more. And that's why I mentioned the role of memories, because much of their knowledge comes from also their parents. So when they come to the classroom, they really are able to distinguish how discursively teachers formulate a nation or a nation's history, and they're able to detect it, except sometimes they do resist and they will question things, but other times they do not. So they go home and obviously they express that dissatisfaction to their friend or their parent and so on.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I remember one of the things that you kind of kept coming back to is that students are never passive. And there's so much of the IB education is about making sure that students are always reflecting, looking at the context, making sure that they're not just taking something in at face value. And so obviously the hidden curriculum is not hidden for them.
Yeah. And we don't want it to be.
No.
You want them to reflect on that and to think critically about it, right?
Exactly. And one of our other guests that we've had in the past, one of the things that he always says is there's no such thing as a neutral education. And I think that in a lot of places, the IB education wants to be neutral in some ways, but then also really active in like teaching students how to be international minded students and things like that. And it's like interesting and really hard to decide where you try to be neutral and where you try to be more active. And I think that one of the big things about the hidden curriculum is taking that step back and being really intentional on these things of like, this is actually where we stand. It didn't just accidentally happen this way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that is so important. And we cannot have this a la carte menu. This is where we're going to be neutral and this is where you're going to, and it's true. Yeah. And I came up with my research as well, because, and I think one of the questions, and I was reading also recently, I was reading work by Daniel Triller, and then he was saying what allows our schools or academic institutions to really they need to reflect and reevaluate any academic institution, IB or not. We need to reevaluate, rethink the extent to which we believe that we are unbiased, rational, and value neutral. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Show me the practices of your school. And I think this is a question for administrators, for teachers, for students. I think they'll give you a real glimpse. Can you show me, kids, the practices that make you think that your school is all these three things? And I think he says rational, value neutral, and unbiased. What are those things? And it'll be interesting to see what students say, what teachers say, and what the taught curriculum, what is actually how the curriculum is executed, and what does that mean? It was interesting that when I interviewed students, there was certainly sometimes a gap between what teachers think they're doing and what students think that the teachers are doing, and that was really fascinating.
Mm-hmm. I mean, as you're talking here, I'm thinking in my own particular context, and especially we have a fair amount of Ukrainian and Russian students here. And when the war kicked off, there was a certain expectation that we needed to kind of remain sort of neutral. But at the same time, I felt like we weren't acknowledging the realities of some of our students. We weren't acknowledging like, you are going through this thing. And in many cases, we have some of our students who are roommates together, a Ukrainian and a Russian student who are now roommates, and suddenly they're grappling with this. And when they go and talk to their educators about it, and we're kind of like, we need to maintain a neutrality and an international mindedness sort of focus on this. I mean, it almost feels like you're kind of muting their identity, you're saying like, no, I don't want you to bring that up right here. And so, I'm kind of wondering like, how do we address that tension in international schools where we don't necessarily want to close down somebody's identity, but at the same time encourage an international mindedness? Like, this is a really fascinating tension, and I'm interested in your research and your sort of thoughts here. How do we address that as international educators?
I think that's the most challenging question. It is I think the question, especially for the last couple of years, that every director, everybody I've been talking to, that mentioned significant challenges. The thing with globalization also, with globalization came a lot of conflicts, right? So you had a lot of religious, national. I mean, we have quite a few conflicts going on, but people do care about conflicts, and communities. As a result of conflicts, communities become politicized. So they do care about what goes on. And once you do not allow that discussion to be in the classroom, then you are muting an aspect of their identity or their national identity, because they all have a mindset on what they think should happen or should be, what the world should be like. They have a kind of a community that they have imagined for themselves. And when you don't address it, then the kids will, and we've seen this, especially in the last couple of years, the kids will rely on other outside sources to find the truth. And what I think, and I think it was, I don't know if it was Weber, I think, who said that we need to expose them to inconvenient facts, right? And how we go about it and how we frame it, I think, and I don't have a solution for this, but I've thought about this a lot, because I think if any school would need a framework, is this: how do you actually, IB focuses on perspectives, but how do you actually navigate this discussion, be it Ukraine, Russia, Israel, Palestine? How do we navigate this discussion? And I think that goes with the intended curriculum. Like, before we sit, beginning of the year, we want to bring up, let's say, one of these conflicts into the classroom. How are you going to frame it? And what are the resources? And really evaluate the resources that we have before we launch into a unit. And how are you going to frame it? Because language can be triggering for some, and how we word things can be we have to be very careful how we word these things. But one thing I would not do is avoid it. That's one thing I would not do, and pretend that this is our little bubble. But because when they go on and go to their college campuses, they're going to be subjected to these things, and how they navigate these things is going to be crucial. So I would not avoid it at any cost. But the framework, I think this is one. We focus so much on AI. We focus, and these are all relevant topics. But the one topic that is really happening, and that our students are so aware of, is these current conflicts that are going on, and they do affect them. The politics, not just the conflicts, the politics outside of school, they love to talk about it. Any platform you can, they want to address it, but we keep, avoiding it. And unless you have a global politics class for those, few students who signed up, chances are that, to be safe, teachers will avoid these things. And let's not do that.
Yeah, no, there's so many things that I want to unpack on that, but it's like, one, I completely agree that avoiding it doesn't work, because also not talking about something is also a stand.
Yeah.
Like, especially if you do talk about something else, there's like the idea of like comfortable, if we're talking about initiatives to support as a school, it's like homelessness. There's not many people who are like for homelessness, or people who don't have homes. Like, we can do a drive for working and for giving supplies to people who don't have homes. No one's really going to get upset about that. But if you start maybe talking about certain conflicts, but then avoiding others, then that becomes a stand too. Yeah. And so I think that's one really big part. I think another part was you were talking about like the global politics teacher. Like, it can't all fall on that poor soul. And if you're sitting here being like, I'm a biology teacher, that's not my problem.
Well, that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm sitting right here. No, I'm just kidding.
It means that it can't just be the TOK teacher who's responsible for this, or the global politics teacher, but it also does mean that you can't expect teachers to just know how to handle these conversations either. Like, it's not easy, it's not natural, and it's not currently part of a lot of teachers' training. But I think that it's something that, like you said, if it's avoided, if it's only put into like one corner of the educational experience, then that also limits it, and it makes it pretend like it's not an issue.
Yeah, that we want to address or spend time on. And I think, because as you were talking here, Dženana, I was really thinking like, this sounds like we need to have some training on like conflict, how to kind of work through conflict, how to kind of coach conversations through that. And, we do have global politics at our school, and not like, we just lend it all to, our global politics teacher to do it. But, I've been in the lesson a few times and really come away just with such a deeper respect for our global politics teacher, because of the way that she can navigate that sort of thing and intentionally makes people kind of take positions and then have a respectful discourse on it. And I guess kind of what you're talking about here, it sounds like we need some like training, I guess, or just an awareness, like don't be afraid to get into these discussions, but also like know how to navigate it in proper ways so that you are allowing people to express their identities without necessarily letting things completely blow up into a full-blown fight in the classroom. Is that kind of the direction you see it going?
Absolutely. And I think one of the things I want to mention is it's not just global conflict, it's the nature of conflict. So yesterday when we had that session, I recommended Michael Apple's Curriculum and Ideology. He actually has a whole section on this, and science comes up. And he talks about how in the scientific community we have this idea that there is a consensus on things, but scientists before they actually produce anything, there's so much conflict that it's not as objective as we teach it to be. It's actually there's so much conflict before anything is produced, and we have to realize that anything that the nature of conflict has to be, we have to be trained and well equipped to actually address it in a way where we don't see it as an enemy, but actually this is something that I need to be able to do in the future in order to be a productive member of my society. So that's absolutely it. And I mean, it's also by not teaching it, you're ultimately saying there is no accountability, right? And the beauty of the international students is that a lot of them are mobile, they speak multiple languages. But if you avoid this, then you also teach them that, well, I'm going to be fine, I'm going to go to this, great university, but when issues of conflict come up, I might just want to avoid that because I want to make sure that I am well off after I graduate. But anything that has to do with uncomfortable discussions, let's avoid it. But that does not align with the cosmopolitan. We can argue it's in a cosmopolitan mission statement that the IB has. Right? Yeah.
Well, it's a citizenship avoidance, right? Like I'm going to silence my voice here in this space. Yeah.
Yeah. You were talking quite a bit about cosmopolitan, that kind of concept yesterday, and then I never got around to talking about it. But for people who don't necessarily know what you mean by that, could you explain kind of the difference between that and international mindedness, or maybe how they play with each other?
Well, the cosmopolitan assumes that we are citizens of the world, and we see that in the mission statement. The international international mindedness is kind of part of that, right? Being internationally minded with the multiple perspectives. But there is a gap in the research. I mean, not a gap, but there is a difference between the two. I guess what you can ask yourself is, an international student, does an international student truly live and abide by the notion that we are all citizens of the world? And this is where I find that there are some gaps, especially on the nature of conflict, on how we validate other people's memories, and so on. We all strive to be cosmopolitans, and you have recent studies now that are on cosmopolitan nationalism, so as a lens. So I don't know that I'm convinced yet, but on this topic, but nonetheless, it's some recent studies perhaps ask of us as educators to, when we actually plan the curriculum and we plan our teaching, that we look at both lenses as a kind of a new approach. And I think it has gained some interest. I mean, I think when you going back to your question, I think it all goes back to really utilizing those mandatory courses like TOK, advisories, where we can ask students, well, what is cosmopolitan? This is the definition of the cosmopolitan. Well, how are you living by this, right? Or how also TOK would be a great opportunity where we can, because these are mandatory courses, and then you can get to expose all the students to this. But most importantly, I think before we teach, we should have an idea on how we want to frame and what we want to bring into the classroom.
Yeah, I'm constantly hearing the part of the IB mission of like other people with their differences can also be right, and that's really what's kind of ringing true for me here. And even just kind of touching back on what you mentioned before with like conflicts that exist in science as we come up with our different ideas. There was a quote that I would misattribute because I can't remember the specific name, but it was along the lines of, all models are wrong, but some are useful. Yeah. And I think this like approach is a really great way to kind of show like there aren't necessarily absolutes that we can have, but we can learn from the differences that exist across our different perspectives and our different ways of understanding things. And of course, now I'm talking a lot of TOK and how does my position as a knower influence what I think is real and isn't real. And so, yeah, I like that you've highlighted this idea of like that mandatory course in TOK. I think really does create a position where we can do this. And just as you highlighted, Courtney, it's not all on the TOK teacher to do that. I mean, I subscribe to the idea that all IB educators are also TOK educators and need to be. And so, yeah, I just see there's a really good place for us to put a focus on this.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Are you an IB educator wanting to improve your practice and needing just a bit more support getting there? Have you ever wanted to learn more about a specific aspect of the DP program or ask a question to an educational theorist about a specific IB aspect? IB Unplugged is the place for you. Simply visit cognity.com/IB Unplugged to submit your question to us and have your question explored in more detail in an upcoming episode. And now, back to the show.
I want to get into this idea because you mentioned earlier like language and some of the power that can come with language as well. And, I mean, IB has kind of the three official languages with English, Spanish, and French. Mm-hmm. And especially throughout Europe, at least in my experiences, there's kind of a dominance of English that operates as like I don't know, it just is there in a lot of IB schools. And I'm wondering to what extent does that kind of show power in those schools and how does it kind of, I guess repress, it's the only word that's coming to mind right now. How does it kind of repress identities of the other students that come to our schools?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think that's such a good question in the sense of that when we talk about whether it's conflict or hidden curriculum, it all depends on your context, right? On your context of where you are. You need to meet your audience, and it depends, where you are, you're going to have different types of outcomes for hidden curriculum. So in one school, it was very apparent, or somewhat apparent that it was all embraced, but it was students perceived it that you're kind of in your own clique. Like if you just hung out with people from your own country and you didn't really speak English well, you're kind of like, oh, well, this set of students, they're kind of to themselves, because they don't speak English. Mm-hmm. Obviously English is important and for students, they see it as a kind of a pathway to universities and future. But it was apparent, and especially with that observed lesson that you asked me earlier, that who speaks the right French, who speaks the right, that there's also those nuances, right? Even if as a national, I speak my language is very important. And, but I was a bit, taken aback with how certain groups who just spoke to each other, be it just German or just French, were perceived by other students, which I didn't see coming.
Yeah, this was reminding me of, I was visiting a school in Dubai that was a really fantastic international group, really a lot of diversity of different nationalities. And we were talking about third culture kids earlier. And we do a lot of interviews with students and things like that. And I was talking to this group, and there was one girl who was a third culture kid. One of the parents was Chinese, and she made it a point to say like, yeah, I mean, I guess I'm Chinese, but I'm not Chinese enough to hang out with the Chinese kids. She's like, I'd rather speak English. I'm more comfortable with that. So I just stick with the other English speaking kids. Like it was like that clear of a difference. And I mean, I know we talked about how language is one of the kind of biggest pieces of identity, but it does make you realize when it becomes to that degree of like choosing how Chinese enough she determined that she was really based on language at that point.
We were talking about sort of nationalism and where people might be coming from, and this is my identity, but the genuine sort of third culture kid who has a hard time answering that question of like, where is my home? What does that mean? I guess when they're in these sort of areas, they get into this international setting. Did you notice where like kind of now all the third culture kids are kind of all together? It's like, here's our German speaking, Russian speaking, Ukrainian speaking, etc. And then it's like, here are the ones who are like, well, I'm technically not a native English speaker, but that's kind of these are my people. This is where I belong now. Did you see that as well in your research? Is that something that kind of pulls out?
Absolutely. Like with the third culture kids, they're very proud to say that I'm a third culture kid. And in some way that they became third culture kid as a result of attending international schools and talking to people from various cultures, and they feel like that they're more open to addressing things with students from various other nationalities or from various other cultures. And but it was interesting also with the third culture kids how sometimes not by no means is it like every child, the way they perceived kids who did not perceive themselves as third culture kids. Mm-hmm. You know, these people stick together and they only speak this language. And I think that's something that we need to be, where you mentioned earlier too, we don't want to make sure that yes, it's great, you're a third culture kid, but it doesn't mean that somebody else's emphasis on their national identity should be perhaps othered in one way or another. Mm-hmm. And your example as well, Courtney, with that one student, I had that come up many times. I don't speak Spanish well enough, so I wish I've learned it when I was younger. Otherwise, I would have assimilated earlier with when all these kids speak Spanish. I just can't join that group. And that was very common, actually. And that's such a great example, yeah.
So it sounds like there's like a real possibility where international schools could end up just creating like many groups that don't really interact, right? They're kind of like, this is my belonging group, this is my belonging group, here's where my identity is, and there's not really a chance to integrate. And I think in international schools, almost all of us could think about like an international day, and we kind of like, hey, let's get together and everybody kind of celebrate where they're from, bring some food and your music and that sort of thing. And I like that. And at the same time, it sometimes feels a bit like a tokenism kind of thing, like, oh, let's just highlight this for today, and then everybody kind of go back to your cliques, I guess. I'm wondering, in your opinion, what are the ways in which schools can kind of move to a more authentic cultural representation, allow people to kind of show their identities while they're still in a positive discourse that embraces the conflicts that might exist, both whether they're political or otherwise? How can we kind of more authentically move into that so it's not just a tokenism, once a week, Mother Tongue Language Day kind of thing or something like this?
So one thing I wanted to mention, like with the intercultural aspect, so majority students really appreciated being in international schools because they get the exposure. So they're not split up in those groups, but if it did happen, they did point it out. But they definitely saw the beauty of this, mingling with people from various cultures. And that was beautiful to see. Like, they would definitely emphasize this a lot. But yes, international evenings, and they value those. Like they say, I learned this and that. But I think when you have this massiveness of presentation on one culture, that's where you have, or certain holidays and so on. That's when you have perhaps some concerns. I think the representation has to be in the curriculum, and I think we've heard this before, especially for the last couple of years. But also the way we present, for example, literature in English class, how we, frame things. And I mentioned this earlier. So having exposure to, in the curriculum, having more exposure to a variety of texts from various cultures, understanding the history of those texts and how we perhaps frame those texts. I think I talked about Persepolis. Persepolis was on one book that was taught in all three all 3 schools, and one teacher did a phenomenal job because she was so immersed with the Iranian culture, and she was living or has been exposed to that culture, and her presentation of that book played a significant role to me. It was beautifully done because she had that experience. And yes, you have that question, how we can't get all teachers to be there because we all have our own different teacher identities, right? That's also another study on its own. What role do teacher identities play? But I think we do have to make our teachers aware that before they go into any units, just how are you going to frame it? How are you going to expose really kids to also this perspective? They need to see it in the curriculum and not just, like you said, international evenings or the walls of the school where you have, diversity pictures and because every school website, if you go to any international school website, they'll pride themselves on how many nationalities they have. And great, like but what are you doing with this? Is this represented in the curriculum, right? And are you bringing all these different perspectives? And how well do you know our students? So I mentioned also yesterday, I wished we did this beautiful unit, and it was about global issues. And our students, I did not know how important some of these issues were to them. And they told me a lot about how they perceive their identities. And I wish I started with that unit first. So that's, to answer your question, I would love for teachers, be it English, history, across, biology, just start with something like, and not just this superficial notion, let's build relationships with you. Yes, but how? And I think having them focus on a cultural issue or something that is really dear to them and having them present on this. And I know it sounds simple, but they were able to bring some really critical perspectives. So one student did this whole thing, and I didn't know anything about this until we did this project just now. And I said, I wish I started this project at the beginning of the year. He was talking about the lack of access to classical music. That only certain people have access to play piano, to explore classical music concerts and so on. That when, he went to see a performance and he noticed that, you can tell the difference of, who comes to these places and who does not. And I thought this kid was just like, in class, I didn't think this was ever like come across, that I'm going to be, looking at this paper. And it was such an amazing reflection. And another wrote about the struggles of women and children when they immigrate from Latin America to the United States. And I was like, I didn't even know this side of you. And I think you can do this across any subject. Tell me about what is really important to you. And especially when it comes to culture, especially when it comes to these global issues, what matters to you? And then you realize, well, had I known this, I would have perhaps done more things about, accessibility. Socioeconomic stuff came up a lot. And that's why I want to mention the hidden curriculum really plays different role in different schools. So in one school, it was very much apparent that if anybody wanted to do a study on the socioeconomic aspect of the hidden curriculum and perhaps the gaps, socioeconomic gaps, even within an international school, that would have been a great school because students would say things, well, it's sometimes tough because when I go on my Instagram, I see my friend having a yacht and here I am. I can't go anywhere this vacation. So that's a powerful statement, right? And getting to know them really at the beginning of the year can alter the way and which perspectives you bring and how you go about bringing them, what they're sensitive to. And it helps you as a teacher. It kind of alleviates a lot of the potential, challenges you're going to have throughout the year.
I love that. And as you're talking, my mind's kind of going of like, okay, here's how I can incorporate that. I teach biology, as we know, and I'm also thinking about other sort of teachers that maybe it's not so obvious. We're not talking about language discourse or cultural sort of settings, but there's so many things that you're kind of mentioning here. I'm like, I could easily kind of pull that in. Do a brief overview of like, what are all the things we're going to be covering in the biology curriculum, things from like ecology to genetics and this sort of stuff. And okay, well, now through that lens, kind of what's happened in your experience, in your background that's kind of related to, I don't know, nutrition or food availability or, the ecosystems that exist in your space and some of the decisions that are being made either in a political realm or economic, something like this that might be affecting these things in your area. So I really appreciate you bringing this up because I think sometimes, as we kind of mentioned, like a science teacher or a math teacher might be like, that's not me, right? I don't have to get into this. But what you're talking about here sounds like a really easy entry point to just say, well, get to know your students, right? That's it, isn't it? Get to know your students, get to know who's in the room, and know your audience kind of thing. And then that you can bring out so much more from the students, you can really have a better opportunity for them to flourish as well, right?
And you learn just so much. And I really, with this unit, I know the global issue is just kind of like a thing for the IB, and you can focus on various line of inquiries, but it was really eye-opening, and I wish I started at the beginning of the year because then I would have paid more attention to certain things and what matters to them.
One of the other tensions that I was thinking about when we were kind of talking about all of this is this, I think it has to be a deliberate decision, but it's a hard one to make for a school, is like how much of a national identity you want for your school too. Like, do you want your school to be the equivalent of McDonald's, where like it could be anywhere, except if you look really closely, there might be one menu difference? Like, do you want your school to feel like, both of you are in schools in Austria, do you want to feel like you are also a school in Austria, or are you
the host country kind of thing?
Exactly. Or are you trying to be like, you could pick me up and drop me off anywhere and you would never know where you are? And I think different schools it's really a spectrum that we see in international school. There's not one right answer, but I think maybe what is the right thing to do is to make sure that it's an intentional decision of deciding where you fall on that spectrum and what that does mean for the students that are in that school, because it's going to have consequences.
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe the first thing we have to do is just sort of understand what is the hidden curriculum that exists in our schools, right? And I guess in your research as well, Dženana, well, yeah, maybe this is just the next thing we need to do. Like, what's a way in which an administrator or a teacher or somebody at the school can kind of uncover their school's hidden curriculum, understand where we're at first, and then maybe we get to that point of answering that question, like, okay, are we comfortable with the hidden curriculum that is present in our school because it honors our host nation or that sort of thing, or do we want to see ourselves being more of a truly international, not dependent on the host school sort of area or host nation area? What's kind of the first step in your opinion, Dženana? How do we kind of go about identifying what hidden curriculum exists in our own contexts?
I think for schools to be doing this, it would be, and I think one, like I said earlier, like it would be really getting to know the students and what they think it is. But one thing I want to mention is, again, great question, because teachers are most likely not aware of it. They're not aware of that it unfolds. They're not aware. Nobody's going with an intention. And hidden curriculum can also have positive things. Majority of things that students said were, we love the intercultural, aspect. We love the meeting other. Those are the positive. I mean, this kid that I gave as an example, who learned about other kids' religion, that's the beauty of the hidden curriculum too, because they get to talk to people from other cultures and they get to learn at the same time. So that's just one thing to keep in mind, that it doesn't have to be negative in any way. But I think what we can do is, again, this aspect of getting to know the students, but also just keep in mind that in my study, it became apparent that in order for the international to thrive, we need the national, or it needs to be considered, right, and embraced. Even if they don't see themselves, even if they say, I don't want any association with it, there are students who do wish to be associated, and just keeping that in mind, that in order for the international to thrive, we do need the national. And before we plan our units, before we go into any of our units, to really look at, are we considerate of these cultures? Are we considerate of the history of these cultures, right? And if I am going to approach a sensitive topic, let me know that these cultures exist in my realm, and I need to be very considerate of this.
One thing I'm wondering, in a lot of the different conversations that we have with how to help support your students, one of the kind of advice pieces that we usually do is like show by doing. With like, if you want your students to be better at reflecting, you should also be reflecting and reflecting out loud with them.
Yeah.
This is maybe a harder place to do that, in the sense of like, how much as a teacher do you show your national identity? Like, at what point do you show your opinion? Like, how do you make students willing to be vulnerable and share their opinions, but like also not taking a side, especially if there's a global conflict? Like, I feel like that's a really hard one to decide how much you are setting an example in this space.
That's a great question, because majority of teachers would say, I don't really want to be associated with any national identity. You'll have teachers say it.
Sure.
So you'll have scholars say it, because a lot of directors say it. Listen, that question, like, where are you really from? Like, it's not a pleasant question, and that's something that we need to consider. So when you actually ask teachers, they'll tell you, like, not all, but they'll tell you that they don't want to be really associated with any national, because they've been mobile, they've been living in one country here, and I don't want to argue that you have to focus on the national, by no means, but you should definitely embrace and consider that there will be students whose language matters to them, memories of how history. And even though they have not maybe spent a day in their nation, they'll have an image of that nation. That was Benedict Anderson's work, even if they've never stepped foot. I had one student who said, I never lived in my country, in my parents' country, but this is where I'm gonna be. This is where I wanna end up, and I love my country. Or I'll have another student say, well, when I'm in the international school, I feel one way, a bit stifled, but when I'm back home, I feel free, and I can be loud, and I can be obnoxious, and I feel kind of and this is, you have such a relevant question, because I by no means do want to say yes, get international, no, but what I am saying is that one thing that they both have in common, this is fascinating from research and in practice, is the sentence, I am international because I don't have to explain myself. I am this nationality because I don't have to explain myself. And what does that mean? So you are American because you don't have to explain yourself, or I'm international because I don't have to then explain myself to anyone else. I mean, they both have that statement in common. And I was like, how do I unpack it, and what do I do with this now?
Yeah. That seems pretty challenging.
So it's I think my emphasis is mostly for the international to thrive. Consider the everything that comes with the national.
Yeah.
And I think and just know that they're both entangled. And I think it will be easier then to approach conflicts, to approach these sensitive topics, keeping this in mind.
One of the thoughts that came to mind as you were asking that, Corinne, or kind of thinking that through, is I just thought of stories. I think any educator, when you're in the classroom, you start to tell a story as opposed to just like going on about the curriculum or a specific thing. Then you automatically notice that students are they engage more, right? We love a story, and so I think there are ways in which I can share more of my identity, I guess, in the classroom when I kind of tell personal stories. My first time kind of encountering this concept or this idea, or even just kind of before the lesson starts, after the lessons, comes to a close, there are moments where you can kind of connect with students through stories, and that kind of invites them to share their thoughts too. And, then the number of times that then students kind of, okay, well, what's your opinion on that? Tell me something more about it. 'Cause I think that story is kind of a way to invite, a better understanding of one another. So would you say, is that kind of a safe place to enter into it? I mean, I'm not necessarily being like, hey, come to the U.S. because you get all these things, but rather I'm just saying, when I was growing up, I had a different context. I was on teams, for example. We had to compete to be able to be in that particular sports setting, and it's different than what you guys have here. And I learned this thing when I did that. And I don't know, to me, that kind of seems like a softer place to kind of get into it without immediately just saying like, let's take a side on the political choices of the US right now or something like that. Is that does that sound like an okay place to be going as a teacher?
Absolutely. I think that's a beautiful way. And I've seen the best teaching with the storytelling. And I saw that a few weeks ago, you guys had a podcast on humanizing pedagogy, which I was working also on. And that is so important. The telling of personal stories or storytelling, because you get to engage them and they love that stuff. The only time that doesn't work for me is when I have these references like, I don't know, from like, a band or like, oh, Tupac. I'm like, who is that? I don't know what you're talking about. Like, and then you realize you're not like, you've been in this business for too long because this. I'm like, let's because we're reading this text and we're gonna look at it with the lens of through Taxi Driver, the movie, and they're like, who is Scorsese? I'm like, oh.
Yeah, like, oh no. I have that happen all the time in my lessons where I'm like, oh, I'm actually a lot older.
But then I realized, that was a teaching moment. I'm like, I need to get into like, I need to meet them where they are. I do need to, in order to tell a story, I need to also see what they like, or what they listen to, and what because that's they love the stories as long as you don't make a reference to something and they're like, I don't know what this lady is talking about.
No, I don't do that. I say you come to my experiences. I'm not coming to you. You come to my experiences.
It's about me, not you.
Yeah, exactly. Right. That's why. Well, I mean, I think we've covered some really important things here, and we've gone into ways, I guess, one, that we can be more aware as educators, and I think that's one of the biggest things, is be aware that there is a hidden curriculum here, and there's things that we can do to kind of bridge that gap a little bit more. And I'm wondering, we've touched on some good examples here, but is there anything else when you think about ways that schools can kind of bridge the gap between their globally minded, international minded mission statements and the actual experiences of students? Are there other things that we haven't mentioned so far that you kind of feel like this is an easy, actionable thing that teachers, administrators, school people can be doing?
I think at the beginning of the year, or just having a session, it's really helpful. And I did this at my school on hidden curriculum, what it is. It's not soft skills. It's easily misinterpreted. It goes back to that question. Have a PD session on what teachers think students should be, or versus, and you'll see the gap of what students are learning to be in their school and what teachers think they're being in their school. And I think that's a great session, or that question about what allows my institution to think that we are unbiased, rational, value neutral, and then elicit all these examples where this might be the case, or where we might do some work, right? And then the final question would be, what is, or whose cultural thesis is really most emphasized in the school? And please keep in mind that students maybe they might not be vocal, but they do know who occupies certain roles. They're very much aware of some of these existing things. They just might not say it. They will say to their friend, and this is where Philip Jackson really was right. The crowd's component is significant. They definitely will talk amongst each other what they see and what they perceive. And one last thing I want to say is we definitely want to nurture this part of the International Baccalaureate, where they should question things. Mm-hmm. And they should especially question academic institutions that perhaps don't allow them to dissent, or that undermine the concept of dissent. They need those questions, and I think that's actually what's going to make them inquiry-based citizens.
I like that. That's super actionable. I can see where we could be doing that in our school too.
Thank you so much, Dženana. This has really been a great conversation. I think there's a lot of questions for teachers to leave asking themselves, a lot for administrators as clear next steps. I think there's a really nice message of, it's not like, this is what you're doing wrong. It's like, these are the questions that you need to ask. And also, these are the things that you need to be vulnerable with your students about, and be willing to ask students what's going on, and just really remembering that they're not passive. They're taking in every bit of this. And that's important. That's what you want them to be doing. But then what are you going to then do about the information that you're taking in from those students?
Absolutely. And if you ever need like a framework, because I'm putting together as part of my research also a framework questions that each school should reflect on. I've put a framework of especially this, the international, the national and the international, what questions you might prompt for your PD sessions or to your students to get some really great ideas that really reflect the mission statement.
Oh, yes, please. Yeah, I'm sure many schools will be on board for that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ženana, you're brilliant. It is so fun getting to chat with you. I feel like I've just gotten smarter just by kind of being around you. So,
thank you guys.
And, I recognize we kind of had a chat live and now we get to kind of re-record this. And I feel like so many other things have kind of sunk in better for me this time. So again, thank you so much for taking the time. Thanks for chatting with us. I hope we get to interact again in the future. You're pretty awesome. I appreciate that a lot.
Thank you guys. Thank you very much.
IB Unplugged is a Cognity podcast hosted by John Patton and Courtney Marlene and produced by Catalina Gaffney. Be sure to subscribe or follow and share with your fellow IB educators. If you'd like to submit a topic, request, or question, please do so on cognity.com/IB Unplugged. Let's keep the conversation going and support each other in teaching with confidence, creativity, and joy. See you next time.